So for those of you who I haven't had the chance to meet, my name is Katie McKeown. I work as a community organizer for the Montana Abolition Coalition. And thank you so much for being here and for joining us for this workshop. I'm really thrilled that a lot of you chose this workshop because it's just so important and informative, and I know I've learned a lot from these materials. So I'll just kind of be a little bit of a facilitator today, and I will introduce our fabulous guest in just a minute. But just to go over really briefly, thank you all for taking part in that activity. We'll return to it later, but let's just go over real quick, and we won't be facing this way too long. So the goals for this session. So our goals today are going to be to explore the historical and changing roles of murder victim family members in the abolition movement. Our second goal is to develop a victim-centered framework for understanding the death penalty. And our last goal is understand guidelines for victim interaction. So we'll just kind of keep those goals in mind. Hopefully we'll meet those goals. I know that our presenter, Jennifer, is going to be very open to questions. I'm very happy to answer questions relating to Montana's efforts as well. So please feel free to jump in and ask questions and things like that. So I'll walk back up here instead of awkward. Okay. So I am so very, very excited that Jennifer Bishop Jenkins is here with us today. I was thrilled that she was willing to come out. She's actually from where I'm from originally, which is just outside of Chicago. So I got to go home over Christmas break and visit my parents, and I got to meet Jennifer for the first time. So she is my countrywoman, I guess. So I'm so thrilled to have her, and Jennifer has such a unique perspective in terms of the abolition movement, because she is, I think, first and foremost, a tireless victims advocate, and that is where she comes from. And so she is just this incredible abolitionist and so active in the death penalty movement. But she's so able to keep us focused on what are victims' rights, what's important when we're talking about victims, and what's ethical and what's correct. And so anyway, she's an inspiration to me, and I'm so thrilled to have her. And without further ado, let's welcome Jennifer Bishop Jenkins.
I feel, thank you, Katie. Katie has been absolutely wonderful. Bringing me here is an honor. It's my first time to ever come to Montana. So I have been absolutely loving it. I don't want to go home. My husband is a former national park ranger, among other things, and we love the outdoors. We love camping. We do the Grand Canyon. We do Estes Park. We're coming to Montana next summer. This is fantastic. I love it here. I understand why you guys must love it here very much. And especially, I just have to say what a delight it is to see my dear friend Marietta again, who we have been friends for many, many years. An absolute joy. I wanted to call attention to the title of the workshop today because I want to talk about tokenism as we get towards the end of the presentation. We're going to talk about, I think, what has been a misunderstanding of the relationship that victims and abolitionists can have. And I think there's been a tendency in the abolition movement to be tokenistic about using victims. And so I really want to kind of push back against that and see what we can do with that. A little bit about myself. I think Katie is right to point out to you that my perspective is primarily not as an abolitionist. My perspective is as a victims' rights activist. I'm a victim advocate, a victims' rights advocate. My husband and I are probably unique, maybe along with Renee, but then he's less so even. But my husband and I are unique in the movement, abolition-wise. We are actually prominent in the victim profession, in the victim movement. It's a huge profession. And yet we are abolitionists. And that is kind of unique. So I'm going to try to bring as much of that expertise. But there is a whole significant national movement working with victims of violent crime. And that would include people who work for prosecutors, people who work for state's attorneys, people who work for police, sheriffs, crisis response teams, sexual assault clinics, domestic violence, people who work in just direct victim services. It's a huge profession. There are, just in the county-based prosecutor employment alone, there are 83,000 full-time professional victim advocates in the United States just that work for prosecutors. And there are, probably 250,000 more that work in direct victim services in some other capacity. So it's a huge field. It's an academic field now. You can get degrees in victimology, and it's a very significant profession. Just most recently, after being a teacher for 25 years and working on gun violence issues, I'm now running for office. I am a candidate for the Cook County Board. If you guys know anything about Chicago, and Cook County is actually better known in some places as Crook County, I'm going to try to do my best to clean it up. I'm also just was appointed this last year to the U.S. Sentencing Commission's advisory group. I advise them on victim issues. I advise also the Victims' Rights Caucus for the U.S. Congress on victims' rights issues. I ran for 5 years a national program for victims of gun violence for the Brady campaign. And I've been with all of the major national and local abolition organizations. I wanted to acknowledge any other victims in the room, and I'm going to start with Marietta. If you would just tell us your name. If you had a homicide in your family, if you would be willing to self-identify, that would be great.
Probably most of you have heard my story, but I live here in Montana, but many years ago I was living in Michigan and came out here to Montana on a camping vacation, and my youngest daughter, Susie, was kidnapped from our tent, and by a very sick young man who, after 15 months, was identified by a telephone call that he made to me on the first year anniversary of her disappearance. And eventually they were able to arrest him, and then went into his home with search warrants and were able to find incriminating evidence. And it turns out that he was a very sick young man and had killed many children. But for whatever reason, I'm the only parent that he ever called. And so I was honored to be able to participate in helping to get this young man off the streets, because he was a grave danger to the children in the community. And through that whole process of my daughter being gone, I really struggled with, for me, what was God's idea of justice. And for me, it is simply that, Jesus is the Word of God made flesh. For me as a Christian, then Jesus is the justice of God made flesh. And I didn't see Jesus going around killing anybody or fighting with people or anything like that. I saw someone who came to help us and heal us and rehabilitate us and reconcile us. And so for me, that was the kind of justice that I wanted. And so that, even though it was a capital case in my daughter's situation, because her life was taken about 2 weeks after she was taken from me, had just recently been enacted legislation permitting an alternative sentence for capital cases, which was not the death. I mean, there was the death penalty, but it was mandatory life imprisonment with no chance of parole. And by that time, that was what I wanted. Although in the beginning, I've been happy to kill the man with my bare hands. I mean, that's a normal, valid human response. And we got to start where we're at. And but it's just not healthy to stay there. So that's my experience with this issue.
Thank you. You don't have to stand or anything, just who you lost.
My name is Carol Nelson, and my daughter was murdered in 2005 on the Flathead Reservation. It was a double homicide. And there was three boys involved in it. And one of the boys got sentenced to go to Boulder The other one of the boys got sentenced to 2 life terms in prison without parole. And the third one, he got off easy because they said that he wasn't involved, but he helped move the bodies. And I felt that he should have got the same court time as jail time as the other 2 because he was there.
In many states, he would have. In many states. Thank you. Thank you for telling us. Anybody else in the room that's a homicide family member or survivor? Well, thank you both for being here, lending to the reality of this. This is my sister, her husband, and there are actually 3 people in this picture, although it only looks like there are 2. This is not the best picture of Nancy Bishop Langert and Richard Langert that I have, but it's my favorite because it was taken literally within minutes of her bounding in the door of my house and saying, "I'm going to have a baby." She just had found out that she was going to have her first child, and you can just see it in her face, can't you? Can't you just kind of see that, "I'm going to have a baby," you know? Especially, it was particularly happy because she was the youngest of 3 girls. I was the oldest. There's another sister, Jean. So there's 3 sisters. Nancy was the youngest. And she was always the last, you know, the hand-me-down clothes, the hand-me-down car, you know. And so she was the first of the 3 of us to become a mom. And so this was she didn't even walk through the door. She floated. She was so happy. And Richard was just the same. They were the happiest guy. We actually found this film in the camera 2 years after they were killed, and so this is very special, even though it's a faded picture. Actually, let me just leave it here for a second. Nancy and Richard were murdered on April 7th, 1990. If you can do some quick math with the date, you'll know that just this last week was the 20-year anniversary. We had a front page paper. I should have brought pictures out of the Chicago Tribune did a front page article on it. Nancy and Richard we were all out celebrating my dad's 60th birthday. They went home to their townhouse that they were living in. And when they walked in their townhouse on a Saturday night to go home, she was 4 months pregnant by this point. They walked in their townhouse, and when they came through the door, they saw a man sitting in their living room, dressed in black, holding a .357 Magnum. He actually had all in black. He was wearing a black trench coat, a black knit cap, and black leather boots and gloves and pants, and he, very costumed like a killer, took them at gunpoint down to the basement of their townhouse, holding the .357 Magnum point blank to the back of Richard's head. And as soon as they got to the bottom of the stairs, he fired and quite literally blew Richard's brains out. And I just have to pause for a second here at this point to say that later, after the crime cleanup, all of that happened, I was the one that actually was the first person into the townhouse and cleaned up the remnants of that. And there was a moment for me about that was just life-changing, I'm sure you can imagine, finding myself on my hands and knees in that basement floor, cleaning that up. I went to the morgue to identify their body. I've never seen what a .357 Magnum can do to the back of, can do to a human head. It didn't, Richard's head was gone. There was nothing but a massive flesh left there. It was unrecognizable. It was an unbelievable thing, and I think about how Nancy had to see that, how the final moments of her life, she was only 25 years old. She, they had everything in the world going for them. They were the nicest people. They had tons of friends. They had a great life. They lived in a safe, beautiful, prosperous community where crime almost never happened. And she had to watch that. And then he turned the gun on her. She was begging for the life of her baby, crossing her arms over her pregnant belly, "Please don't kill me, please don't kill my baby." And he pointed the gun directly at her abdomen and fired. And later, when we did the autopsy, we wanted to find out the name. We wanted to bury the baby with its name because we knew the boy and girl names that she had picked out. The bullet had actually hit the fetus so directly that it exploded the fetus. We could not even tell the gender of the child. This was before DNA. So we were unable to even, we just had to bury the baby Lankert, which was really sad. But so again, Nancy's last moments were watching her husband's head get exploded, then to beg for the life of her baby, be shot where her baby was, and then he fled the scene, leaving her paralyzed and bleeding to death. And the worst part for me, no question, is that we know that she lived between 15 and 30 minutes after that. That she tried to get up the stairs, that she couldn't, that she called for help, no one came. The neighbors heard, but they didn't think anything of it. And that ultimately the last thing she did before she died was she crawled over by her husband, she pulled herself over by Richard, and with her hand in her own blood, she drew this heart and a U. You can actually see where the DNA swatch was taken out of it, but that was her last act of life, was to tell us that she loved us. She did that all the time. She always signed the little heart and the U thing. I have to tell you that this very profound act of hers, that she only had minutes, maybe even seconds left, that she knew she was dying, that she chose to use that last ounce of life in her body to talk about love, is quite profound for me, and has dramatically shaped the person that I have become. And yet, I could not even think about it. I couldn't go there in my mind, and I'm sure you guys know, for months. I really could not, because in my mind, you know, I was dealing with the investigation and the police and the funeral and all the, you know, news media and all the stuff we had to deal with. I literally, if I felt myself in my mind going to think about what her last moments were like, I just was like, oh, no, I can't go there. It was just too painful. But on the night of the killer's arrest, 6 months later, I had a very dramatic experience. And it was just in my own heart, between me and Nancy, really, where they had arrested the offender, and the first thing they found out about him was that he was only 16 years old, and that he lived across the street. And that he was 4 weeks young, too young in Illinois law. He was almost 17, but 4 weeks too young by Illinois law to be executed. And there we were, having to deal with the press on the night of his arrest. And the first thing that happened is a very famous reporter in Chicago stuck a microphone in my face and said, "We just found out he can't get executed. Aren't you upset? Aren't you upset that he can't get the death penalty in Illinois?" And that, my friends, is the first moment that I was able, and I don't know why, but it was the first moment I was able to go with Nancy on that basement floor and be with her. It was the first time I was able to think about what she was trying to tell us, what she must have been thinking, what she must have been feeling as she lay there at 25 years old, her life ebbing away. I realized that she knew in that moment a very profound truth, which is that love is the most important thing in the world. And I knew that the rest of my life was going to be about honoring that and memorializing that. And that's when I just kind of shook my head to the reporter and said, no, my sister was full of love. She never would have wanted the death of another human being to be her memorial. And that ended up on the TV, and oh, Jennifer Bishop Jenkins is against the death penalty, and it all went from there. It was an amazing career that came. But just a little bit about the killer, that he was a sociopath. He was very wealthy, bright, but got a thrill and a rush out of committing crime. His parents always bailed him out and never held him accountable. He is now serving 3 life without parole sentences in the Illinois Department of Corrections, and he is one of the many young men embroiled in this, as am I now, unfortunately, embroiled in a national debate about the sentencing of juvenile offenders to life in prison without parole. What were the ages of the offenders in your case? You said they were boys, but I was just curious. The one that got life? 19. So that would not apply because this would be 18 and under. But I'm dealing now with a Supreme Court case and doing a lot of very high-profile news media around that because we may have that overturned by the Supreme Court. We'll see. So watch for me in May or June around the Supreme Court. I did become an activist, very much compelled by my sister's, I feel, mission that she charged me with. I work against the death penalty. I was on the cover of the Tribune magazine for saying that I forgave the killer. You all notice who these, do you guys know who these men are in the upper right-hand corner? Who knows who those men are? Who is he?
Mayor Daley and Brady.
Jim Brady.
Jim Brady.
Yes, that's Mayor Richard Daley of Chicago, and Jim Brady, who is the, who was President Ronald Reagan's press secretary that was shot. I had the very great privilege of working for him and with him for many years, and I still do. A very great man. Oh, you guys will laugh about this one. I gotta go back for a second. This press conference down here at the bottom, where I'm with all these victims at the hospital, just to the left, I shouldn't have cut him off, is Rod Blagojevich. I shouldn't have cut him off. Next time. A wonderful redemption of this tragedy in my life, and I don't believe that God gives us the tragedies. Human beings choose to do these great evil things. But I do believe that God allows us to redeem these tragedies. And redemption of tragedy for me, besides getting to be here with you all and getting to have friends like Marietta, the real redemption for me is that I got to meet this man, Bill Jenkins, whose son was murdered in Virginia in 1997. He's the author of the book, What to Do in the Police Leave, A Guide to the First Days of Traumatic Loss, which you can get. It's the best book for victims out there, and it has been an amazing, amazing gift to me to work across the country, Bill and I together on this team. His son was shot and killed in a robbery, and he's, being your classic college professor, he wrote a really good book to deal with it. Okay, let's talk briefly, very briefly, about what victims are. Just so you know, there's two aspects I want to focus on today. One is the legal aspect, and the other is the psychological. Legally, being a victim is a term that is recognized in law. It's the only term we've got, and I really get tired of this sort of whole, don't play the victim, or, oh, victims, you're whining because, oh, you're being the victim, and, it's like a disempowering thing. No, the victim is the word in law for a person against whom a crime has been committed. If you've had psychological, physical, property damage done to you because of a crime, you are a victim. That's what the law calls you. There's no pejorative to it. There's no disempowering to it. I'm a victim, and I'm the least disempowered person I know. It's not disempowering to be a victim, and I think our movement needs to own that word a little bit more. I've been frustrated with its misuse. The other thing that's important to note is what happens to victims in their brains. There is actually something that happens to anyone that has been through a trauma. And it may not be a homicide, it could just be another kind of trauma. Maybe your house is blown down by a tornado or something. But a trauma has a very specific kind of impact on the brain. And so one of the things that is important to understand about victims is that they are neurologically and psychologically different than everybody else. Because of, and it can vary depending on the seriousness of the crime and the seriousness of what happened to them. But there is a permanent effect that is led to it. And if you've ever taken psychology in college, maybe you've heard of Abraham Maslow and his hierarchy of needs. This is a description of what a healthy human being looks like, their needs being met. And if you understand Maslow, each of these, you have to have the one below it in order to have the ones above it. You can't be working on your master's degree if you're starving to death, okay? You have to have these in order. And what happens with victims is that this rung right here, this very basic safety and security needs, is literally ripped out from underneath them. And everything above it topples. Okay? And so just think about that in terms of your interactions. It's just important to note. And obviously I'm flying through stuff that most people get, PhDs in, so we're just kind of skimming the surface here. But just to give you a sort of colloquial understanding of how the brain has changed. In a normal event, like we're sitting in a room having a conversation, this is a normal event. And you guys are, as part of that, you're inputting information, you're hearing my voice, you're hearing the information, and your brain actually takes information and files it and sorts it into something called schemas. Mostly it's filed away during your sleep. I don't know if you guys knew that you need to get a good night's sleep at night so that the brain has time to do its little thing that it does every night to sort these things out. But also constantly your senses at the subconscious level in the brain are evaluating for threat. You're looking around the room. No scary looking people in here. The door's closed. No gunmen running by. No sirens, you know. This feels like a safe place. You're all relaxed. You're hearing things and we're not feeling threatened. But what happens in a trauma is entirely different. And traumatic memories, there's a picture of 9/11, traumatic memories are actually an explosion of information, and our good genetic history allows us to literally open up with our senses and input tons and tons of information at one time. That's a survival mechanism. That's a good thing. That we can quickly evaluate, you know, what do I need to do, where can I go? And people's memories of traumas are very vivid because your senses just open up and you grab in lots of information. But if I can use an analogy that I hope most of us in the room are old enough to remember, and if there's any young folks that don't, I apologize. I don't know if you know this. But how many of you have seen the I Love Lucy sketch with the chocolates on the assembly line? Okay? It's very funny, but it's the best analogy. My husband actually thought this up. I think he was right on target. That it's really exactly what happens during a trauma. You guys remember that they were wrapping each piece of candy as it came down the line. They were not to let any candy go past. And they were doing so well that the manager comes in and says, "Speed it up." And then they start flying out. And they can't get them fast enough. And so unwrapped, unprocessed, they grab them and just stuff them wherever, in their pockets, down their blouse, in their cheeks, in their hair. And it's very funny, but that's exactly what happens during a trauma. The memories are not processed like memories. They are not stored like memories. They don't feel like memories when they are reawakened because they are just grabbed and shoved wherever. And they are literally located in different places in the brain than experiences normally would be because they're just shoved wherever. And that means that they're very primitive, very powerful, very disorganized, and that they can be prompted and reawakened by literally almost any association. So you have to be really, really careful because when they do reawaken those feelings, it doesn't feel like a memory to them. It feels like now. It feels like it's happening now because it's not stored like a memory. So what murder victims' families need really is compassion and empowerment and sensitivity. They really, really, really need information. Information is like a lifeline. And Marietta's story, I think, is a very powerful example of that. That you spent, almost a year on the telephone with this offender, trying to get, and being patient and talking to him, trying to build a relationship with him just to get any little piece of information. I mean, there's no more powerful example of how important information is to victims' families. They need to know what's going on. They've had their safety rung ripped out from underneath them. They need to know things. They need a sympathetic ear and they need to have their feelings acknowledged and validated, and you shouldn't ever say to them things like what my mother's boss said to her a few months after Nancy and Richard were murdered. "Aren't you over that yet?" Okay? Literally, that happens. Access to resources and a help to understanding, but remember that they can be in shock and a crisis state even years afterwards. You have to be very, very careful. What they don't need is unhealthy expectations, platitudes. Oh, I could do a whole workshop just on platitudes. I'm sure you all know some. Things that people say, trying to be nice, but not really knowing what to say. You guys got any examples for me? Give me an example of a platitude.
This too shall pass.
This too shall pass.
It's God's will.
It's God's will. We don't understand, but you just have to trust it's God's will. What else? Anything else? You'll feel, you'll get over it. Do you have any other children? You'll get over it. Maybe you can, have another child again someday. There's all sorts of, God must have wanted another angel in heaven. You just have to learn to forgive and get past it. All of those things. Total, I really want to slap you. Disempowerment, taking things away from them in terms of control and decisions. Sometimes the most immediate crisis and shock can be best after you communicate your love and support, just to give them a simple choice. Would you like to sit down Would you like a glass of water, or would you like to go lay down? Would you like to be alone, or would you like me to stay with you? Giving them little choices. That's very important, okay? They don't need to be used. They don't need to be re-traumatized in any way. Here's why some of us oppose the death penalty, and I, can't really give you an exact number, but you guys can help me guess. Marietta probably knows as many as I do. I'm going to guess that it's a minority of victims that oppose the death penalty, maybe a fourth.
However, every time we tell our stories, people
More
come
join us,
and
join
say,
us. Yeah.
It's
It's more than you think, but it's not. I don't want to pretend that we represent a majority.
Yeah.
We do not. But for those of us that do, these are just a few of the things that I have heard over the years. Certainly for me, I think the first one was very important, because I really understood, for Nancy herself to, she was murdered. She was the one that was killed. She was the one who watched her husband killed, her baby killed. She was conscious of that. And her response is the one that I took my clue from. She chose love, and I wanted that to be the last word. That is her last word on it was the last word on it, as far as I'm concerned. So that's, for me, the reason. Victims often, I think, come for very pragmatic reasons, to understand that the death penalty just lasts longer. It takes decades sometimes to get through the system. We've got some victims, until Governor Ryan cleared off death row in Illinois, we had some victims that had been waiting 28 years for some resolution. That's a horrible thing to do to families. Sometimes it has to do with how we memorialize our loved ones, or our understanding of justice. For example, the symbol for justice in our country is this blindfolded woman with the scales, right? And she's on our courthouses and so on. And you think about, obviously, justice is a very elusive concept and a very difficult one to understand. But to the extent that we understand it as being about balance, the death penalty is the one that says, okay, Nancy, Richard, and the baby are dead. Your daughter, dead. Your daughter, dead. But we're going to kill this guy here, and that's going to make it okay.
What an insult.
What an insult! Exactly. I think it's an obscenity to suggest that to victims. Killing this guy is going to fix, balance out, make up for that? No. In a way, to oppose the death penalty as being wholly inadequate as a response. The reason why I was so, I think, thrown into this moment with this reporter asking me how I felt about the execution issue right there, I wanted to say how inadequate that is in the way of a response. So I think that we can talk about totally wanting to be about the victim and recognize fully in that moment the complete and utter inadequacy of what the death penalty is. It actually replicates the very act. Like if you have had somebody killed, to kill, you've heard the old saying, why do we kill people? We kill people to show that killing people is wrong. The Star Trek fan in me, Mr. Spock, says that's illogical. It's illogical. It doesn't even make sense. It puts violence and death and killing into more people's lives. And as you really, I think, well pointed out, Marianne, it's really not healthy for you physically. The death penalty actually makes the case last longer. It limits the fiscal resources in your state. It requires you, I've actually had prosecutors say, you just have to hang on to your anger. Just hang on. If you love them enough, you can stay angry long enough. Okay, that's a horrible thing to do to a victim. To require them to stay angry for years. Because anger is basically, and I did a whole workshop on this at the Bereaved Parents at the USA conference a couple of weeks ago. Anger is a transitional emotion. It's a very appropriate emotion to take you from situation A to, whoa, bad news, new situation B, okay? Like you're driving along the street and somebody whacks you upside of your car and you're angry, okay? Because here in situation A, my car was fine, and now in situation B, my car is wrecked by this guy. I'm angry. That's a transition emotion. It's a very appropriate emotion. It's not meant to be lived in forever. It's only meant to be taking you from one situation to the next. It does divide families. Some families are for it and against it, and then they end up turning on each other about it. It's used politically by elected officials to advance their own tough on crime agenda. It impacts our humanity to actually think about and spend time on wanting somebody else to die. It delays their ability to grieve. Families actually put off grieving, thinking I'm just going to hang on until that execution happens. And I actually was with John, I don't know if you guys have heard of John Wayne Gacy, Illinois' most famous mass murderer. He, and I'm sure you guys all get my point that none of you probably know any of his victims. But I was with some of his victims after the execution. They waited 15 years in some cases for the execution, delaying their, saying I'm not